Hello, Afri family. Well, come back. Please subscribe to my channel. And so Imran returned to the printing shop that morning with a strange mixture of heaviness and clarity pressing on his chest, the old machines rattling with their mechanical rhythm as if they too were echoing the heartbeat he had begun to feel pulsing through the city, and he set himself to work with a diligence that surprised even his employer. Though in truth it was not diligence alone, but a kind of prayer in motion, each inked sheet a whispered vow, each pull of the lever a reminder that stories and words were not mere commodities but vessels of memory, bridges across time. And as he watched the ink spread into letters, he thought of Marcus, whose name was still spoken in hushed reverence, of and whose gentleness lingered like perfume long after her footsteps faded, of Cale, whose sacrifice had become more than a tragedy, it had become a seed. And Imran realized that in these printed words, in the labor of his hands, he too was tending a garden of memory, though the soil was heavy with dust and the air thick with silence. Yet still the seeds refused to die, and when his boss, a stout man with a voice like gravel, barked at him to hurry, Imran only nodded with a smile, for inside he heard An's voice telling him that love was not heavy, that love was the strength that carried the weary. And so he carried not just stacks of paper but also the quiet weight of a vow older than himself. And at midday, when he stepped into the sunlit street, he saw the market with new eyes, the fruit seller wiping sweat from his brow and still arranging his baskets as if the act itself held dignity, the women calling out the prices of yams and peppers, their voices weaving into a song older than the city's dust, the children darting between stalls like birds unafraid of tomorrow. And he thought, this is it, this is the heartbeat that Marcus felt, this is the vow Cale died for, not some monument of stone but the living rhythm of people enduring together. And as dusk fell once again painting the sky orange and purple, Imran walked home barefoot with his shoes in hand, and though the ground was rough it was also real, and he felt himself woven into that fabric stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death. And the days that followed did not blaze with miracles but with small revelations that stitched themselves into him. An old man who greeted him every morning with a nod though they had never spoken, a group of young men who shared roasted corn by the roadside and offered him a piece without question, a tired mother humming to her child while waiting in line for water, and through each fragment he felt the ember inside him glowing, never roaring into flame but steady, like a lamp against the dark. And slowly he began to write, not with grand ambition but with the quiet urgency of someone who knows that silence is a kind of death, scribbling late at night on scraps of paper, lines that were part memory, part dream, part witness to what he saw in the streets. And sometimes as he wrote he felt An's hand on his shoulder or heard Marcus's calm voice telling him to keep going, that words mattered because they carried breath, and breath was life. And one night he dreamed of Cale walking barefoot across the same dusty streets, carrying nothing but still radiating the strength of one who had given everything. And when Imran woke he wept, not with despair but with a strange gratitude that his own small life had been folded into such a vast current. And as months passed, the city itself seemed to respond, for though corruption still sat heavy in offices and silence was still demanded in certain corners, yet in the alleys and in the markets and in the songs of children there was a new boldness, faint but undeniable. And Imran saw it most clearly in the eyes of those who came to the printing shop asking timidly if their poems, their pamphlets, their quiet manifestos could be printed, and he, with trembling hands, agreed, for he knew the risk but also the necessity, and the machines clattered on like drums of defiance, spreading words that carried the heartbeat further, until one evening when soldiers marched into the market with their boots and rifles and scattered the sellers, he stood at the edge of the crowd, fear tightening his throat, yet he did not run. And he felt again that he was only a single thread, but a thread still matters, for without threads there is no fabric. And as the soldiers shouted he thought he saw Marcus standing calm at their center, and cradling the frightened children, Cale walking steady into the line of fire, and he realized these were not ghosts but echoes woven into him, living through him, and he whispered under his breath, "Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary," and though no one heard, he felt the words ripple outward like water dropped into stillness, and he returned home. That night not defeated but resolved, his shoes once again in his hand, the dust clinging to his feet like a baptism, and he knew the vow was not his alone but belonged to all who refused silence. And so he kept walking, kept writing, kept printing, until the hum of the city was no longer dull but a chorus, imperfect yet unbroken, carrying forward the ancient song that no regime, no fear, no death could ever silence. And so the printing shop became not just a place of labor but a kind of altar, where Imran, though he did not name it so, felt himself offering something unseen each day, the clatter of the presses and the hiss of ink against paper echoing like a ritual that stretched backward into centuries of men and women who had carried truth through storms. And while his employer barked orders and cursed when the machines faltered, Imran kept a quiet patience in his heart, because he had come to understand that every sheet, every leaflet, every small pamphlet carried not only words, but fragments of the heartbeat of the people. And sometimes when he placed the papers into neat stacks, he would run his fingers across them as if feeling for a pulse, and he did feel it, faint but steady, and this pulse reminded him of Marcus, who had stood against walls of silence, and who had carried love as if it were a lantern through endless dark, of Cale, whose blood had watered the ground from which new courage grew. And Imran realized he was not apart from them, that their vow had seeped into him like rain into dry soil, and it was this vow that made him notice the smallest things with almost painful intensity: the fruit seller's trembling hands, the mother's lullaby sung on a cracked stoop, the barefoot children whose laughter did not wait for permission, the mechanic who whistled tunelessly while bent over rusted engines as if sound itself were resistance, carrying whispers of endurance. And in the evenings when he walked home through alleys that smelled of frying oil and would smoke, he would take off his worn shoes and feel the ground beneath him, rough and hot but real, as if reminding him that he belonged to the earth of the city and not to despair. And he would remember Anne's words: "Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary." And those words would echo in his ribs until he lay down in his small rented room where the walls were thin and the roof leaked. Yet he felt less alone than ever, because in his dreams Marcus appeared not as a monument but as a man with calm eyes sitting across from him, and appeared not as a distant saint but as a mother's face in the market. Cale appeared not as a ghost but as the barefoot boy running past, and each dream braided itself into waking until Imran could no longer tell where memory ended and where imagination began. And it was in that in-between place that he began to write. At night, scribbling on scraps of paper, verses half prayer, half testimony, lines that stuttered with fear but would not stop flowing, and sometimes he would pause, the candle guttering low, and whisper aloud, "Who am I to write?" But then the ember inside him would flare and he would answer himself, "You are no one, but you are everyone, a single thread, and without threads there is no fabric." And so he kept writing. And in the shop he grew bold enough to slip his words into the stacks, hidden between advertisements and announcements, words that might reach a stranger's hand and remind them that they too were not alone. And when he saw a boy at the market reading one of those scraps aloud to his friends, laughter rising around it, he felt a tremor of hope so sharp it nearly broke him, because he saw that words were not dead ink but sparks leaping from one life to another. And soon others came to the shop, timid at first. With folded papers they wanted printed, poems and testimonies, questions disguised as stories, accusations hidden in allegory, and Imran, though afraid, agreed, because he knew that silence was a coffin and printing was a kind of resurrection, and the machines rattled louder, like drums in the night, carrying these small rebellions outward. And when he walked through the streets he began to see signs of awakening, a mural painted on a crumbling wall showing hands joined together, a song hummed by schoolgirls that spoke of freedom without naming it, an old woman selling cola nuts who pressed one into his palm and whispered, "Keep going," though she did not know his name. And he felt that the city itself was stirring, though its rulers tightened their grip, sending soldiers to patrol the markets, demanding bribes at every corner, arresting those who spoke too loudly. Yet still the hum grew, faint but undeniable, because it lived in places the soldiers could not reach, in lullabies and laughter, in prayers muttered under breath, in the steady gaze of those who refused to bow. And one evening, as the sun bled purple across the sky, soldiers stormed into the market, scattering sellers, overturning baskets, shouting that order must be kept, and Imran stood at the edge of the crowd, fear knotted in his stomach, ready to flee. But then he remembered Cale's steady walk, Marcus's calm eyes, Anne's gentle strength, and he realized they were not visions but inheritances, and he whispered, "Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary." And though no one heard, the words steadied him, and he did not run. He stayed and he watched, and when the soldiers finally left, the sellers returned, gathering their spilled goods, straightening their backs, laughing bitterly but laughing still, and Imran knew that the vow was alive, not in him alone but in them all, and that night he walked home with his shoes in his hands, dust clinging to his feet like blessing, and he wept, not from despair but from a fierce gratitude that his life, small and ordinary, was part of something vast, and the days became months, and the months became seasons, and Imran kept working, kept writing, kept printing, and though sometimes the fear was sharp and the silence heavy, still the heartbeat continued, weaving itself through the city until it was no longer just a hum but a chorus, imperfect but unbroken, carrying forward the song that no death, no silence, no fear could erase. And Imran understood then that he was only one thread, but even one thread can hold when woven into many, and he smiled, tired yet steady, because the fabric was strong, stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death, and in the weeks that followed Imran found that his hands no longer shook when he fed the heavy rolls of paper into the printing press, for the machine's groans and rattles had become to him like the breathing of a companion, steady and loyal, carrying his fear away with each revolution of the drum, and though his employer still scowled and muttered about wasted ink or torn pages, Imran knew that behind the man's complaints there flickered a kind of pride, for the shop's business had grown, not because of advertisements for shoes or wedding announcements alone, but because people had begun to come with fragile manuscripts folded into their pockets, trusting that their words might be given shape and spread like seeds, and Imran, though he was no master printer, handled each page as though it were scripture, careful not to smudge the lines, whispering to himself that words had weight, words had breath, and that once released into the city they could never be entirely caged again, and he marveled at how the city itself seemed to lean closer, as if listening, the market women chanting their prices with a sharper rhythm, the children painting chalk messages on walls that soldiers might scrub away by day but which reappeared by night, the old men who gathered under the neem tree in the square no longer speaking in whispers but in measured tones that carried farther than before, and Imran felt himself both small and immense, a single drop and yet part of a rising tide, and at night, lying on his thin mat beneath the leaking roof, he would imagine Marcus sitting with him, calmly explaining that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to walk forward while fear still gnawed at the bones. Courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to walk forward while fear still gnawed at the bones, and in bending close to remind him that tenderness was not weakness but the very marrow of strength, and Cale striding ahead barefoot to show that even the ground itself could be hallowed by sacrifice, and these visions, or perhaps memories woven into dream, did not distance him from the real city but tethered him more firmly to it, so that when he walked through alleys smelling of roasted plantain and engine oil, when he greeted the weary shoemaker bent double over his work, when he accepted a cup of Gary from a stranger who had little enough to share, he felt that each encounter was sacred, a stitch in the vast cloth of endurance, and sometimes as he watched the children chase each other through dust rising golden in the evening sun, he would whisper under his breath, "Love is not heavy. It is the strength that carries the weary," and the words seemed to float outward, settling invisibly on those around him, and he believed, perhaps foolishly, that even if only one heart carried them forward, it was enough, for embers spread by breath alone, and breath was life, and life refused to be silenced, and when once more the soldiers marched into the marketplace, their boots hammering the ground like threats made flesh, and their rifles glinting in the twilight, Imran felt his throat tighten but his feet remained firm, because he knew he was not standing alone. He was standing with Marcus and Anne and Cale and all the nameless ones whose quiet refusals had built a bridge across generations, and when the soldiers shouted and scattered the traitors, the people gathered again, slower this time but with eyes steady, and Imran saw in their faces the same vow that burned in him, and he understood then that the fabric was not yet finished, that it was still being woven thread by thread, and he smiled through the dust and the fear, because he knew he was part of it, a single thread, yes, but a thread strong enough when bound to others to resist unraveling, and so he returned to the printing shop the next day with his shoes in his hands and dust still clinging to his feet like blessing, and he worked until his arms ached, until the ink stained deep into the lines of his palms, and he whispered with every pull of the lever, "Stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death." And so the printing shop became more than a place of livelihood for Imran. It became a furnace in which the heat of the presses and the smell of ink fused with the heat of his own restlessness. A place where he came each morning with dust still clinging to his feet from the walk through the alleys, and left each night with a humming of machines still echoing in his ears like a heartbeat that refused to die. And in that hum he began to hear something greater than metal grinding against metal. He heard the rhythm of a city that had endured through storms and betrayals, through hunger and silence, a rhythm older than monuments, as old as the first market stall built on that soil, as old as the first child's cry lifted toward a reluctant dawn. And though his employer continued to bark at him, to curse when a page smudged or when the ink was too heavy, Imran listened not to the curses but to the hidden cadence beneath them, a cadence of persistence. For even the man's anger meant the work was worth defending, and Imran knew that in those stacks of paper leaving the shop each day lay more than announcements for weddings or advertisements for shoes. There were poems folded carefully by trembling hands, testimonies disguised as stories, questions veiled in allegories, sparks of defiance hidden in metaphors, and he handled each one with a reverence he did not even show to food, sliding them gently into place, pulling the lever of the press with arms aching but heart steady, and as the letters imprinted themselves onto paper he felt as though the city itself was imprinting onto him, carving lines into his soul that would not fade. And in the quiet moments when the machines paused and the dust floated in shafts of sunlight through cracked windows, he thought of Marcus, who had once vowed to protect the dignity of people against the drowning silence, of and whose eyes had carried the gentleness of rain yet the strength of stone, of Cale, whose bare feet had carried him into the storm of bullets, and he whispered their names as though to remind himself he was not alone, that he walked in their shadow yet also beside them, and he began to notice with an almost painful sharpness the details that others overlooked. The old fruit seller who straightened his baskets with trembling hands yet still placed each orange carefully as if it were treasure, the weary mother whose lullaby rose above the noise of the market like a secret hymn, the barefoot children whose laughter pierced the evening air like bells, fragile yet unbroken, the shoemaker bent double over torn sandals yet whistling a tune no one else knew, and Imran saw that these lives were not small but immense, because in them beat the same vow that had carried Marcus and Anne and Cale, the vow to endure, to love, to carry one another even when the world pressed down heavy, and each evening when he walked home through the alleys he would remove his shoes and carry them in his hands, letting the ground toughen his soles, feeling the dust cling to him like a baptism, and though his room was small, the roof leaking, the walls thin enough to let in the arguments and laughter of neighbors, he did not feel alone, for in his dreams Marcus would sit across from him calmly as though at a kitchen table, and would rest a gentle hand on his shoulder and whisper words of courage. Cale would stride ahead barefoot, beckoning him forward, and these were not ghosts but presences, inheritances, voices stitched into the fabric of his own breath. And he woke each dawn not lighter but stronger, the ember in his chest glowing though the world outside remained gray, and in the nights when sleep refused him he began to write, scribbling onto scraps of paper whatever rose in him, half prayers, half testimonies, verses that stammered but would not be still, and sometimes he would pause, holding the pen above paper, and whisper, "Who am I to write?" Yet the ember would flare, and he would answer himself, "You are no one, but you are everyone, you are a single thread, and without threads there is no fabric." And so he wrote, slipping his words between the stacks at the shop so that a stranger might find them folded into the margins of an advertisement. And one day he saw a boy at the market reading one aloud to his friends, laughter and amazement sparking around it, and his heart trembled with a hope so fierce it almost broke him, because he saw that words were not dead ink but sparks leaping from one life to another, and soon others began to come to the shop, hesitant at first, with manuscripts hidden in their pockets, small collections of poems, pamphlets of quiet protest, confessions written in the safety of night, and they looked at him with eyes that asked without speaking, "Will you help us?" And though he was afraid he nodded, for he knew that silence was a coffin and printing was a kind of resurrection. And the machines clattered louder, like drums in the night, carrying these small rebellions outward, and he began to notice the city listening, murals appearing on crumbling walls of clasped hands and rising suns, schoolgirls humming songs that spoke of freedom without naming it, an old woman selling cola nuts who pressed one into his palm and whispered, "Keep going," though she did not know his name, and he realized the city itself was stirring. The hum of its heart growing bolder though rulers tightened their grip, soldiers patrolling markets with rifles, bribes demanded at every corner, arrests made for words spoken too loudly. Yet still the hum could not be silenced, because it lived where rifles could not reach, in lullabies, in prayers, in laughter shared over roasted corn by the roadside. And one evening as the sky bled purple the soldiers stormed into the market, scattering baskets, shouting that order must be kept. Boots hammering the earth like threats, and fear surged in Imran's throat, but his feet did not move, because he remembered Cale's steady walk, Marcus's calm eyes, and gentle strength, and he whispered, "Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary." And though no one heard, the words steadied him, and he saw the traders return, slower but steady, gathering their goods, standing straighter, laughing bitterly but still laughing, and he knew then the vow was alive, not in him alone but in them all. And that night he wept on the dusty path home, wept not from despair but from gratitude that his ordinary life had been folded into something vast, and as days became months and months became seasons. He kept working, kept writing, kept printing, and though fear still sometimes gnawed at him and silence still pressed heavy, the heartbeat continued, weaving through the city until it was no longer a hum but a chorus, imperfect but unbroken. And one morning when he woke to the dull murmur outside his window, he realized the murmur was not dull at all but layered with countless voices, some tired, some hopeful, some angry, some tender, and he understood that the vow was not a relic of Marcus and Anne and Cale alone but a living river running through every ordinary soul who refused surrender, and he smiled through his weariness, pulling on his worn shirt, stepping barefoot into the morning dust, shoes in his hands, ready once more to walk toward the shop, to feed the press, to scatter sparks into the waiting hands of strangers. Because he knew at last that though he was only a single thread, the fabric was strong, stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death. Imran returned to the printing shop that morning with the same quiet step he had carried through the alleyways, yet within him something vibrated differently, a pulse he could not still, and as he pushed open the wooden door whose paint had long since faded into a tired shade of green, the familiar scent of ink and old paper rose to greet him, a smell he had once associated only with labor and monotony but now seemed to whisper of possibility, of voices carried and multiplied, of truths etched into paper so they could live longer than any single breath. And he glanced at the worn machines, their iron frames steady despite years of clattering use, and he thought of them as companions, not chains, as vessels waiting for the words that might one day ignite hearts. The master of the shop, a stooped man named Musa with spectacles that always slipped to the edge of his nose, looked up at him briefly and nodded before returning to adjusting a lever, and Imran greeted him softly, his voice carrying more steadiness than before, then set to work stacking reams of paper, aligning margins, watching ink roll across rollers like rivers spreading across fields, and with each repetition he began to sense that this too, this act of printing, of multiplying, of sending forth, was part of the vow that Marcus had once taken, that Cale had once carried like fire in his chest, for words were weapons when truth was buried, and paper could be a battlefield where silence was defeated. And as his hands moved mechanically his mind moved elsewhere, to the market outside where the fruit seller with trembling hands still arranged his baskets, to the barefoot children with laughter like bells, to the weary mother whose embrace was both shield and prayer. And he thought of how each life was a story unprinted, unrecorded, fragile in its brevity, and yet enduring because it touched another, and another, weaving a pattern invisible yet indestructible. And as the machines clattered he almost heard beneath their rhythm another rhythm, the same hum he had noticed at dusk, that ancient heartbeat of a people refusing surrender, and he felt himself not merely a laborer but a participant in some larger manuscript being written with sweat, tears, and quiet endurance across the whole city, across the whole land, and in that recognition his chest swelled with a courage that did not announce itself with shouts but with the simple act of continuing, of not breaking, of keeping step with the rhythm even when his feet ached. At midday he left the shop for his short break, walking through the market where the sun had turned relentless and the dust rose in thin veils that made the air shimmer, and he bought a small piece of fried yam from a woman who had been selling in that same corner for as long as he could remember, her face lined not by defeat but by years of weather and laughter. and as she handed him the food wrapped in old newspaper, she smiled with the tired generosity of someone who had given more than she had received, and Imran bowed his head slightly in thanks, tasting the salt and oil and the faint bitterness of burnt edges, and even this he thought was part of the fabric, the way hunger met nourishment, the way survival tasted sharp yet sustaining, and as he chewed he found his gaze wandering to the walls around him where faded posters still clung, some announcing past rallies, some advertising goods long gone, and he thought of how the city itself was a palimpsest, written over again and again, yet always carrying the faint traces of what came before, just as Marcus and Anne's vow remained beneath the surface hum of every ordinary day, unseen but never erased. When he returned to the shop, Musa asked him to deliver a stack of freshly printed pamphlets to a nearby school, and Imran carried them carefully through the streets, their weight pressing against his arms like a reminder of responsibility, and as he passed children chasing a punctured ball and women haggling loudly over tomatoes, he wondered who would read these pages, whose eyes would rest upon the black letters he had helped press into existence, and whether even a single line might spark in someone the same ember that had lodged itself in his own chest, and for a moment he felt almost dizzy with the enormity of it, the way one hand passing paper to another could alter the hidden architecture of thought, like dropping a stone in a river whose ripples reached further than sight, and he remembered Anne's voice again. Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary, and he thought, perhaps these pages too could carry, not the weight of oppression but the strength of endurance, and that thought steadied him as he reached the school where children's voices spilled out like an unbroken hymn. The teacher who received the bundle was a woman with bright eyes despite her plain dress, and she thanked him with a nod that conveyed more than politeness, a recognition perhaps, and he left quietly, carrying back with him not emptiness but a strange fullness, as though giving away the papers had added something to him rather than taken something from him. As evening approached and the sky began again to shift toward its hues of orange and purple, Imran felt that old rhythm returning, stronger now, less faint, as if the city itself knew he had begun to listen, and as he walked home he noticed the music drifting from a nearby compound where neighbors had gathered, drums and voices rising together, and he paused, watching the circle of dancers move, each step stamping dust into the air like small explosions of joy, and he realized this too was resistance, this too was vow, to sing and dance and move even when the world tried to grind them down, and he felt tears sting his eyes though no one noticed, and he carried that sound with him all the way back to his rented room where he lay on his mat staring at the cracked ceiling, hearing again Marcus's calm voice, Cale's fierce promise, Anne's tender strength, until they seemed less like memories and more like companions, walking beside him through the streets, standing with him at the press, sitting silently as he ate, and he whispered into the dark that he would not let their vow be forgotten, that he too would carry it, not with grand speeches but with steady steps, with eyes that noticed, with hands that worked, with a heart that refused to close, and as he drifted into uneasy sleep the hum of the city merged with the hum of his own blood, one rhythm, ancient and unbroken. The next morning he rose again, and again the day looked gray, but within him the ember burned, and though he could not yet see where it would lead, he felt that even the smallest act, the turning of a page, the handing of a paper, the meeting of another's gaze, was part of something vast, something enduring, something stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death, and so he stepped once more into the streets, into the hum, into the vow made flesh through the lives of ordinary people who refused to surrender their humanity. Imran rose before the sun had fully lifted its golden head above the city's jagged rooftops, and though the sky outside his small rented room was still gray with the residue of dawn, something in him pulsed with restless wakefulness, as though the ember planted by Marcus and Anne had grown overnight into a quiet flame, and he stepped into the narrow alley with worn shoes in one hand, the cool earth pressing against his bare soles, feeling the hum of the waking streets beneath his feet, that ancient rhythm threading through vendors setting up their stalls, children yawning as they were roused for school, roosters crowing stubbornly against the roar of buses sputtering to life, and he thought again that this city, for all its dust and noise and weight, was alive in ways no decree or silence could suffocate, and as he walked toward the printing shop the smell of frying akara drifted through the air, mixing with the sharp scent of petrol and the dampness left by the night's brief rain, and Imran inhaled deeply, telling himself that this too was part of the vow, the remembering of small things, the honoring of every detail life offered. And when he reached the shop with its tired green door and the machines waiting like patient beasts, Musa greeted him with a grunt, sliding his spectacles up his nose, and Imran smiled. Not because there was anything funny, but because he had begun to see Musa differently, as one more thread in the vast fabric. Was anything funny, but because he had begun to see Musa differently, as one more thread in the vast fabric. His bent shoulders not merely tired but also enduring, his eyes behind the glass holding a light of persistence, and as Imran set about preparing reams of paper, aligning them with careful hands, he felt again that each page was a fragment of a larger story, that the ink rolling across rollers was not just mechanical but sacramental, carrying truths from one voice into many, and the steady clatter of the machines became almost like drumming, a heartbeat reminding him of the vow, and though no one else seemed to notice, he sensed the shop was not a place of confinement but a quiet forge where resistance was stamped into existence letter by letter, page by page. By midday, sweat had gathered on his brow, and Musa sent him to deliver a new stack of pamphlets to the market square, and so Imran carried them against his chest, the papers warm as if they bore their own pulse, and as he walked through the streets he saw again the fruit seller with trembling hands arranging oranges with dignity, the barefoot children chasing a battered ball whose laughter seemed like music too pure for the world, the weary mother pressing her infant to her chest with an expression of exhaustion mingled with infinite love, and Imran felt the veil lift again, reminding him that this city, though scarred, was radiant in its persistence, and he wondered who among them might read these pages, whose heart might quicken at a single sentence, who might find within the printed lines an ember of their own, and the thought filled him with awe, for he had once believed himself invisible, a mere laborer. Yet here he was carrying something that might ripple beyond him like a stone dropped into endless waters. When he handed the bundle to the schoolteacher, a woman with bright eyes and a plain dress, she thanked him with a look of quiet recognition, and in that look Imran felt again that he was not alone, that something larger than either of them had passed silently between them, and as he returned to the shop, the afternoon sun burning hot above corrugated roofs, he carried the sense that every errand, every gesture, could be part of the vow if only one stayed awake enough to see it to tea dusk. When the sky turned its familiar orange and purple, he walked home slowly, bare feet again kissing the earth, and paused when he heard drumming from a nearby compound, voices rising together in song, bodies stamping the dust into clouds of joy, and he thought this too was resistance, to sing and dance when the world tried to grind you down, to insist upon joy even in the shadow of hardship, and tears stung his eyes though no one saw, and when he finally lay on his mat staring at the cracked ceiling, Marcus's calm voice and Anne's tender one and Cale's fierce one wove themselves together in his memory, until they felt like companions in the room, and he whispered into the darkness that he too would not let their vow be forgotten, not through speeches or monuments but through steady steps, through eyes that noticed, through hands that worked, through a heart that refused to close, and he slept with the city's hum merging with the hum of his own blood. The days that followed unfolded in much the same rhythm, rising, working, delivering, returning, yet Imran no longer moved through them as a ghost. Instead, each task seemed stitched with meaning, each face he passed a reminder of the vow, and he began to notice things he had never noticed before, the old tailor who hummed hymns as he sewed torn garments into new life, the bus driver who shouted harshly yet secretly allowed passengers who could not pay, the young boy who sold groundnuts with eyes too wise for his years yet still managed to grin when someone greeted him kindly. And in these details Imran saw not random fragments but threads of the same tapestry, proof that the vow was alive not in grand gestures but in ordinary persistence, in love disguised as survival. Sometimes, when the machines at the print shop clattered into silence for a moment, Imran would close his eyes and imagine Marcus walking beside him, and speaking softly at his shoulder, Cale standing watch at the door, and though they belonged to a different time their presence did not feel distant. It felt folded into the very fabric of the city, into the dust that rose at dusk, into the laughter of children, into the ink staining his fingers, and he realized that the mythic and the ordinary were not separate but one and the same, that the vow was both ancient and current, that the heartbeat he felt was theirs and his and the city's, unbroken and unbreakable. And as weeks stretched into months, Imran's smile grew steadier, not because life had become easier. It had not. The prices of food still rose, the work was still heavy, the nights still lonely. But because he no longer mistook difficulty for defeat, and in the midst of hardship he carried within him a fire that no silence could extinguish, and he found himself speaking more gently to those around him, helping Musa lift heavy bundles without being asked, sharing food with the boy who sold groundnuts, pausing to listen to the old tailor's humming, and each act felt like a thread woven tighter into the fabric, a way of saying without words, "We endure, we belong, we carry each other." One evening, after delivering yet another set of pamphlets, he lingered by the riverside where the water caught the last light of the sun and rippled with colors too rich for words, and he thought of how rivers never stopped, how they carried both silt and gold, both refuse and beauty, and he saw in that movement a mirror of the vow, carrying all things yet never ceasing, and in that moment he felt not small but infinite, not alone but bound to every life that had come before and every life that would come after, a single thread in a fabric stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death, and as he finally turned to walk home, he carried with him the certainty that no ember once lit could ever truly die. It only waited for breath, for hands, for hearts willing to keep it alive, and Imran knew that his heart, tired yet unbroken, would remain awake to that task for as long as it beat. And so the days lengthened into weeks, and weeks into months, yet for Imran time did not feel like a chain dragging him forward into sameness, but like a current pulling him deeper into some hidden river where the surface shimmered with the reflections of the ordinary. Machines clattering, Musa muttering over ink, children shouting in the alleys, women bargaining in the market, while beneath it ran a darker, stronger underflow, the vow, the voices, the hum of lives woven together by endurance and love. And as he worked at the printing press, he sometimes felt as if the words stamped onto paper rose like smoke into the air, mingling with the breath of Marcus and Anne and Cale, as if their promises had never died but had only changed form, dispersing into air so that anyone awake enough might inhale them, and he found himself pausing mid-task, his hands ink-stained, staring at the words not as marks on paper but as living things, as sparks carrying a fire from one soul to another. And in those moments Musa would glance at him sharply and grunt, thinking the boy distracted, but Imran would only bow his head and return to work, hiding the strange light swelling in his chest, a light that grew each time he carried bundles through the streets, for it was not only pamphlets he delivered but also the possibility of awakening, the weight of unseen memory, the trembling continuity of a vow that seemed to move through his very veins.